Hello, and welcome to Fierce Conversations with Toby, the show where we talk about the hard things. I'm Toby Dorr. In today's episode, we'll get a glimpse into the hard work of bearing witness. Our guest today is Laura Collins, an Emmy Award-winning investigative journalist. Born in Scotland, she's worked for some of the UK's biggest media outlets and reported from around the globe. Today, she is the Chief Investigative Reporter for the Daily Mail, where she regularly contributes the most read stories to the world's largest newspaper website. Laura lives in New York City and through her work has visited almost every state in the U.S. Laura is often invited to sit down both with people who have survived unthinkable horrors and the families of others who have not. She is grateful for their trust to have been invited into their lives and for the opportunity to have borne witness to the strength of the human spirit as well as its depths. Hi, Laura. Thanks so much for joining us. It's delightful to see you again. It's been a while. We did meet like last May, I think, and I think you just had such an interesting perspective on world news that I wanted to be sure and get you back in here to the podcast to talk about some of those things. I like to ask all my guests a question that gives us a peek into who you are, and it's a simple question. What's your favorite color, and what does that say about you?
That is a simple question, but like many of the most difficult questions, they're simple ones. So I find it really hard to say a favorite anything, which may say something about me. I'm not sure what. I think if I have to plump for one, I'm going to say a nice strong orange. And I hope that maybe suggests that I am bold and positive in some way.
Yeah, I love orange. It's one of my favorite colors too. So I think it's a pretty cool color. Can you tell us about a crossroads in your life that pushed you in a different direction?
Yes, it's kind of a personal one, but I guess it also became a professional crossroads too. But it was about 11 years ago. I was living in Abu Dhabi with my then husband, and he got offered a job back in London where I just moved from to join him over there. And things weren't really working out in the marriage. It became that sort of crisis moment, and I decided not to go with him. And that really was a major crossroads, a major decision I made. And I guess it led to, well, the demise of the marriage. But it also opened up doors in the sense that it led me to the job that I'm in today. If I'd gone back to London, I would have probably rocked back into the job that I was in before and maybe the sort of slight rut that I was in before. And instead, it really forced me to make some changes and it opened up a whole new world.
I think that's beautiful. The best thing I think about a crossroad is that no matter which direction you go, you're going to make a change in some way in your life. And I have found that the most drastic changes have the most drastic results. So I can totally relate to that. You were on the ground in Minneapolis following the death of George Floyd. You covered the civil unrest that followed and then returned for Derek Chauvin's trial. You were also in the courtroom for the Kenosha shooter, Kyle Rittenhouse's trial. What's it like to be wrapped up in such intense drama of these major cases?
Well, it is intense drama. You're right. And I don't think journalists are immune to that or that sense of getting caught up in it. It becomes the only thing you want to talk about. It makes you probably a very dull friend or a dull partner for a period of time because you're so obsessed with the minutiae of what's going on in the courtroom. I think when it comes to reporting it, though, you have to be able to sort of keep a level head. I mean, you can get caught up in the intensity of it all and the detail, but what you mustn't do is editorialize too much. You're not there to preempt decisions. You're not there to second guess a jury. You certainly can never tell. It doesn't matter how many trials you do. You just have no idea what a jury is going to do at the end of the day. So I think for me, it's a very satisfying thing because quite often I'm bouncing between stories, different stories all the time. And it's nice to be sort of embedded in one story for as long as a trial takes. Of course, with the Bill Cosby trial, which I covered, it was more than one trial. So I don't think anyone expected that we would be back in the same room doing it all over again. But it's just, it's a fascinating thing to be part of. It's a very satisfying part of the job.
I think it would be so difficult to not have a personal opinion and having a personal opinion to let that personal opinion show. Like, for instance, when you report on the jury's decision, And if you had a totally different decision, it'd be kind of hard, I think, to maintain that neutrality.
I guess it's always a challenge because, as a journalist, you're also a human being who has, as you say, opinions and a viewpoint. And sometimes you can't believe that something goes a certain way. You think, were they watching the same trial as I was? But at the end of the day, as a journalist, it's not my opinion that I'm reporting. I'm not an opinion article writer. So, well, I have done that historically. But if you're there just to report, you just have to report the facts and keep it pretty straight and not editorialize.
So, what is the most important thing to you in the telling of a story?
That's a really good question. I suppose the guessing of the story is the starting point. And in order to do that, you have to, I guess to some extent, you have to do that thing of trying to set your own views aside, your own opinions aside, and your own preconceptions of what that story might be. You don't know it until you sit down with someone, like when we sat down together, until you sit down with a person, you just don't know what the story is that you're going to be telling. You might have some notion of it, some situations more than others. But the truth is, guessing the story is the important bit, and then actually thinking, okay, now this person has spoken to me, or now I have this set of facts. How do I order these? What's the priority here? And that will depend on who you work for, the other news of the day, how it maybe relates to it. I mean, I guess the key thing is being sure of your facts as much as you can be. Actually having the story nailed down is probably the most important part of that process.
So, keeping an open mind, it sounds like that's important to you, because you may go into a story with one idea of how you're going to tell it. And then in interviewing that person, you may discover something that leads you in a different direction.
Absolutely. And sometimes you have that sense, totally. And there's that sense sometimes, and I've certainly experienced it, where you think, oh, I haven't got the story. So it doesn't play out the way you expect. And you think for a minute, I've not got the story. And then you realize, wait a minute, I've actually just got a different story. Maybe it wasn't the one that I was looking for or thought that I would find. But you have to make a virtue out of, that turn of events as well, and recognize, well, this is a story. It's just not the one I expected to be telling.
Yeah. And sometimes the story you end up with may be even bigger and better than what you had a frame of mind to tell. So that would be kind of interesting. It's kind of almost like you don't know exactly what you're going to do in a day. Some mornings when you wake up, you see where the day takes you.
I never know. Yeah, I never know.
That's pretty interesting. So recently you covered the Vicky White and the Casey White case. And for those of you who don't remember, Vicky was the deputy in Alabama that helped an inmate escape. In fact, that case is how we met, because you came to my house to interview me about the similarities between Vicky's story and my story. And I remember both of us with tears in our eyes when we tried to discuss Vicky's choice to end her life and how devastating it was to both of us. So, how do you keep from becoming emotionally attached to the stories you cover? And I don't imagine you can. So, if you can't, then how do you deal with that emotion? How do you keep yourself in a healthy place?
Well, that is another very good question. And I guess the truth is, maybe I don't always keep myself in the most healthy place in that respect, because you're right. You can't help but get emotionally involved in certain stories. I mean, whether it's the facts of the story, whether it's the people that you meet along the way. I mean, you mentioned Vicky White and her story. I mean, there was such a degree of tragedy in that and sadness in her life. And I don't think you can tell a story properly if you don't have a degree of compassion and empathy. And if you have that, then you feel it. I mean, I guess you have to be able to draw a line to some extent, because maybe draw the line between what is emotional engagement that helps you tell a story, and what is self-indulgent, because the story is not about you. So it's not about how it impacts on me. It doesn't matter if I go home and cry in the evening to get it out of my system. You have to be able to set that aside, because you're no use to the person whose story you're telling. You're no use to the publication you're working for if you're kind of a crumbling mess. I think one of the biggest misconceptions, and I'm kind of glad that you asked this question, is that journalists are cynical creatures. I think most of the best ones really aren't. I think you need that degree of emotion. And I think a lot of them struggle with it, frankly. I mean, certainly back in the UK, drink's a problem with a lot of journalists, because you go and have a drink at the end of the day to try and sort of decompress. I think the older I get, perhaps the better I get at dealing with that. And you recognize you need to look after yourself physically and mentally as well if you're going to be any use to anyone. But you can't you can't avoid emotional engagement. But you're right, it is something you need to kind of keep an eye on.
That makes perfect sense because in order to really tell a story well that people want to listen to, you have to be able to empathize with the person you're talking about. So I do see that it's really important for a good journalist to be able to have that sympathy and compassion and empathy in order to tell the story. And you're right, you can't have that without being a little bit emotionally involved. So I imagine some days you're just exhausted with the emotion from the day.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I just got back from a few days in Florida. I was covering a story which I'd already covered, several months ago. It was a horribly sad story. A guy called Jared Bridegan, who I don't know if you're familiar with the story. He's a father of four who was shot in a targeted attack almost exactly a year ago. And his 2-year-old daughter was strapped in the back of the car when her father was ambushed. I mean, there are just so many aspects of the story that are
I do remember that story.
yeah. So it must have been, again, almost a year ago that I met his widow, Kirsten, and I kept in touch with her. And I definitely feel an emotional connection to her. And I must admit, going back and doing the story again, I didn't want anyone else to go and do it from our publication because it feels very much like it's my story. But I definitely felt that emotional toll sounds very self-indulgent because, it's such a small echo of the true sort of tragedy of the case. But I feel for that family, and it is emotionally a genuine thing. So, you do sort of, I felt quite tearful at certain points during those last few days, which sounds a bit pathetic, but that's just the nature of the beast.
Well, I know that we've kind of developed a friendship after you came here and interviewed me. So, I can see that happening. And I think that that's healthy. I was going to ask you what story you've covered is the one that stuck with you long after it was finished. And perhaps it's the one you just told us about. I'm not sure. But is there another one that you'd like to mention?
Yeah, I mean, that certainly is one. There's a few. There genuinely are a few. Your story actually stuck with me because it was so wrapped up in so many things, and and also just having met you and how open you were, and frankly inspiring from everything that you've gone through and what you've taken from it. So that stuck. There's been a few stories. There was the case of Jamie Kloss, the teenager who was abducted. She was in Barron, Wisconsin, a little town in Wisconsin, and in the middle of the night, a guy came and shot both her parents and abducted her from the house. And she was missing for, I think it was about 3 months. And really, it seemed very unlikely anyone was going to see Jamie again. And then she emerged from a cabin in the woods, sort of walking through the snow with sneakers on her wrong feet because she managed to escape. That stuck with me because, again, there was a period of time of bonding with her family, I guess, and the people who were working in the case as well, the law enforcement, stuff like that sticks. And I think the reason why some stories do particularly stick is because at the heart of them, there's an injustice that either somebody's looking to right, or there's some wrong that really can't be righted, and that's kind of like a barb that sticks with you because no matter what these people do, there's like you know somebody has died, somebody's been killed. There's no righting that wrong, but there's as close as you can get to it. So it just sticks with you, and the people stick with you. So there's a few, a few over the years.
I could see that. I I could see that. And a lot of people think that journalists and the newspapers are all about sensationalizing the news. And there are some reporters for whom that is important. And I've come to know that you're not one of those kind of people. Do you ever encounter instances where someone wants you to sensationalize something to make it juicier, or do you ever have to have that battle?
I mean, yes, I'm sure over the years. Yeah, I mean, I've been doing this a very long time, as you know. So, yes, over the years, I guess the older you get, the more robust you get in sort of standing firm on things. I think perhaps, and this is no disrespect to any of my current bosses, I should say that for the record, but I think there's perhaps a tendency with people who are in an office who've not actually had direct dealings with any of the people involved, who are not on the ground. It's easier to go down a sensational path. It's easier to just see it as just a story or just a headline. But when you're actively dealing with people, for real, you're having the conversations, you're sort of the custodian of their story, then you kind of have a duty of care for them, for the story. And I think, I think to some extent, maybe sensationalism gets a bad rap. So to some extent, some stories are sensational, but I think the point is they don't need you to over-egg that. They don't need gratuitous sensationalism. Your story was sensational, like in the most true sort of sense of the word. It appeals, it appeals to the senses. It captures, it brings you in. And the best way, I think, to convey something like that is just to tell it straight. If you're interviewing a person, let them talk. Don't insert yourself. Don't have, that. I guess the tendency is people back in the office writing a headline want the sort of the wham bam, and it needs to sell a story as well. But I think the key is maybe trying to rein back or push back on anything that just feels gratuitous and unnecessary. I think that's the thing. And yeah, over the years, I've definitely had those experiences.
Well, I think, the sensational headlines sell stuff, but the stories that stick in people's minds and that resonate and that they think about for days after reading them are the ones that are more empathetic and compassionate and show the human side of the issues.
Yeah.
So I think that's great. So in 2009, you wrote a best-selling biography of Kate Moss, and you just finished a collection of short stories and a novella entitled The Art of Leaving. And you're also working on a new novel. Writing news stories is pretty much a public endeavor. You're actually out in the field talking to other people. And being an author, I found, is really a lot more private and isolated. So how have you found that transition? Is it a natural thing or is it putting on a whole different hat?
It is definitely a transition. You're right. Natural. I'm not sure. I mean, it's a process, and I suppose I'm sort of learning my way through it. It seems strange as somebody who's written professionally for the past 20 something years to feel like a novice in writing is an odd thing. But you're right. There is that aspect of it is a much more private endeavor. I mean, I don't think when I'm writing articles, I'm not thinking this is going to be read by. I mean, we have millions of people who read our site. I don't think that because I think that would probably be a paralyzing thing if you suddenly thought about that. But when it comes to, you'd freak out. But when you come to doing something like a novel or short stories or the novella, it's weird. There's basically a layer of myself that you don't see in my journalism because it's not appropriate for it to be there. But there's a different sort of exposure with writing fiction. It feels far more personal in a way. There's I'm not telling somebody else's story. I know it's a fictitious story, but there's kind of me on the page in a different way. And I find that's a little bit daunting. And also the challenge.
Yes, I could relate to that.
Yeah, it's a very personal endeavor, isn't it? But you're doing it for public consumption, or at least you hope for public consumption. You want somebody to read it one day, but there is a different anxiety about what will that reception be when somebody does read it. It's interesting. I mean, I'm enjoying it. Yeah, I'm enjoying it. I'm loving it, but it's definitely, the beginning of a very long journey, as they say.
Yeah, I found writing to be very healing and very introspective and very insightful to myself. And I think that, perhaps writing a news story, not quite so much because you're really focused on a story. So I think it'd be an interesting transition. I can't wait to read your book. So I'm really excited about that. When it comes out, we'll be sure and let everybody know. You've traveled the world as a reporter. What's one place you'd like to return to and why?
That's a tricky one. You're good at difficult questions, by the way. So thinking about that, can I have two places that I'd like to return to?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. So globally, I was lucky enough to have gone to both Bhutan and Japan. And I would love to go back to both of those places one day because they're so profoundly different from anywhere else I've ever been. And I mean, they're beautiful. And both places are beautiful in very different ways. But they were just sort of breathtaking places and fascinating. And it felt like, one trip was just, dipping your toe in the surface. I would love to spend time there. But, there's also so much. I've seen a lot of America, but there's still some bits I've not seen. So there's also so many places that I've yet to see, that it feels like I can't start going back to places I've already been when there's so much of the world I've not yet seen.
Mm-hmm. That's true. That's true. My husband lived for 6 months in Japan, and he talks about how totally different everything is there.
Yeah.
And he
Yeah.
loved it. So I can relate to that. Yeah. And one of the places I've always wanted to visit is Scotland, and which is where you're from. We just watched a documentary last night on Edinburgh Castle, and it's just fascinating. So,
well, that's my
and
hometown.
the Firth of Forth, and really, Edinburgh.
Yeah.
Wow,
that's my
pretty
hometown.
cool. It took my husband and I, it took us about, 10 minutes of research to try to figure out what in the world a Fifth of Fourth was. It was just so interesting. Yeah. What's the first and what's the fourth? And
gosh, now you're asking. But yeah, I mean, obviously I'm biased, but I would recommend a trip to Scotland if you can do it. Which, I mean, why not? I was actually just back there just after Christmas. So
yeah, Chris has been in Scotland, my husband, and he was showing me on the map where Kingsport is. What is it? What is the one across the bay from Edinburgh? Kinghorn.
Oh, okay.
His dad's mother's was a Kinghorn. So when he was in Scotland, he went there and was talking to the people in Kinghorn because that's where his family was from, and that was their name, which I thought was really interesting.
It is. And that's something that I really noticed traveling around America, the number of Scottish names there are all over places. Scots definitely get about the place. There's lots of connections.
It certainly does. Yes, it does. It certainly does. So what's one question you wish I'd asked you, and how would you have answered it?
It's funny because I always ask that question at the end of interviews, and now I realize how hard it is to answer. Yeah, because it's that classic thing that there's always something that you can't think of. I have to say, I think you've been exceptionally thorough. I mean, I think we touched on, what is perhaps the most important aspect of, or what I think is the most important aspect of being a reporter, of being a journalist. But I guess the one thing that I would just maybe reiterate is, I think, or maybe I didn't quite say it, was the importance of compassion. And maybe that sounds a little bit sort of worthy, but I think it's an overlooked aspect. And I think people think about the news as hard hitting and rushing around the place. And my goodness, there's never a shortage of pretty difficult stories to read and consider. And right now is no exception. But I think within what is often a very challenging environment, and often leading you to encounter perhaps not terribly pleasant people, and certainly not terribly pleasant situations, I think holding on to compassion is a really good sort of anchor. And I think, I think that's like one point that I would just like to iterate, I suppose.
I think that's beautiful. When I read your bio, it said that you said that you feel like your job is bearing witness and telling stories, other people's stories. And I don't think you could be very good at that without compassion. So I think it's just critical. And I love how you throw compassion into your stories. Honestly, I've been interviewed by several journalists who weren't compassionate at all. And it makes such a difference. I think the story comes out different. It comes out more useful and important to the people who are listening to it, because I think they get the real story when your motto is to bear witness and tell people's stories. I just think it's a beautiful thing. And I am so grateful for you coming into my life and willing to be on my podcast. And I am sure that we'll be talking a lot more in the future. So thanks so much, Laura.
Oh, you're so welcome. I'm so thrilled to be asked.
One of the things that I like to be sure everyone knows is so important, and that is that none of us is our worst mistake. We all have so much more to offer the world, and those so-called mistakes are blessed opportunities to learn and grow. Next week, we'll continue to bring you inspiring stories by people who've identified a need for change and are working to make a difference in the world. Subscribe to our Patreon channel, Fierce Conversations for special access and behind-the-scenes info. Go to patreon.com/Fierce Conversations or click on the link in the show notes. 10% of the Patreon proceeds are dedicated to providing workbooks to women in prison. The show notes also provide a link to purchase my book, Living with a Conviction, and a link to get more information about Laura and her work. In my memoir, Living with Conviction, I recount a conversation I had in prison where my friend Lisa told me, "In here, we can talk about all the hard things. In fact, I think we must, and so we shall." This is Fierce Conversations with Toby. Until next time.